It's been exactly 2 months since 4 University of Idaho college students were murdered in their off-campus home. Late last month, police arrested a suspect, 28-year-old Brian Kohberger. And tonight, Dateline is airing a 2-hour special about the murders and the search for a suspect. Our Morgan Romero spoke with Dateline host Keith Morrison earlier this afternoon ahead of tonight's show.
I'm joined by Keith Morrison, correspondent with Dateline. That is airing tonight right here on KTVB. Keith, thank you so much for your time this evening. We want to get right to one of the biggest things that's been talked about throughout this case. Wild speculation, false theories, misinformation spreading on social media, places like Reddit, Facebook, Twitter. How did that impact the investigation into the murders?
Well, let me start with just by saying that I've never seen a story so attract attention as this one has. This is amazing. Everybody in the world wants to know about it, and I've talked to reporters from all over who want to be there. And there's a tremendous amount of interest in it, continuing interest, and a huge demand for information, much of which is simply not accurate. And that spreads on the internet so fast, and it, unfortunately, along the way, has kind of besmirched the reputations of several people who didn't deserve it. You know, I don't really know what they were thinking about that inside, except that they kept things pretty close to the vest for as long as they possibly could. I think that the statements that were made were, you know, sometimes went viral in a way that wasn't intended. The investigation itself proceeded as most investigations do. It was competently done, but it just took a while to figure out who this guy, this potential suspect was. When you think about it, it really wasn't that long for a murder case. They often go on for a very long time. But the fact that they were able to, get to the clues and eventually get lucky on a few things was great, but they had to keep it very secret in order to get there.
Right, not to compromise the case. We've all read the probable cause affidavit that was released last week. When you look at that and you realize how early on investigators had their sights on Brian Kohberger and they were tracking that white sedan that turned out to be a white Hyundai Elantra, there was sort of a near miss where they knew the car and then the individual went to a different state. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, that's a good deal of what you're going to see in the program tonight. We were able to kind of sort all of that out. I will say that the very bright cop who was in charge of this investigation also happens to be an English major. It was a very well-written affidavit. So did they know early on, or did they find out later? How did they find out later? What triggered the discoveries that would tip the case? All of those things are fascinating. And they're what we've been able to get into in our program tonight.
We are looking forward to that. You mentioned how law enforcement kept information close to the vest, and they still are with the probable cause affidavit. We know not even giving all the evidence that investigators say they have. But when you look at the information that's come out and the speculation that's gone on, how do you think that the evidence finally came together as they sifted through all that?
The evidence came together the way evidence does, the way good evidence does. It has to connect with something substantial, something you can put your hands on and get your fingers around and see, something that'll stand up in court. So in this case, the most important evidence is the DNA. The DNA didn't arrive until much later in the case than most people imagine it did. The DNA didn't become significantly important, that is. The car, which was very famous and everybody was seeing the car everywhere, was early on more of a problem than a solution. So again, we'll unravel it all in a way that makes sense on our program.
You touched on DNA. We know cell phone records and video surveillance of the car also played key pieces. But going back to the DNA, what type of DNA was really helpful in this? Well,
first of all, where they got lucky, of course, was finding that knife sheath right there at the crime scene, right beside one of the bodies. They find a sheath for a very specific kind of knife, a K-bar. It's a sheath that has a button snap on it, which is difficult to open and close. And for anybody to open and close it without leaving their own DNA on that knife sheath would be pretty difficult. And sure enough, they got it. They sent it away to CODIS, and there was no match. So then they sent it to a genealogical a company that does genealogical DNA. And this is, I think, where we will discover that some new inroads were made in that science. They were able to narrow this down to a very small group of people in a very specific area of the country. And that's how they got to, it must be somebody in the extended family, not terribly extended family, of Brian Koberger. Once that came back, they authorized the garbage retrieval, and the two matched up, and there we are.
I'm sure as genealogy has progressed and advanced, you're seeing cases that play out similarly, right?
Yes, and we've seen a lot of them in recent years, and it's many cold cases are being solved now because of genealogical DNA. Every police force has got a bunch of them that they're working on. This one, though, was faster than any other I've seen. I mean, they only had a fairly short period of time to narrow everything down, and that's a complicated task. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that process.
Last question for you, Keith, before we wrap up and let you get on your way. Who can people expect to hear from tonight?
Mm-hmm. Well, you'll hear from some parents. You'll hear from people who have been close to the investigation. You'll hear from friends of the victims. You'll hear from people who knew Brian Koberger, some of them who knew quite well. You know, the people who were associated with the investigation intimately are unable to speak because there is a gag order. So we had to work around that, and we've done so. But I would say the central part of our program tonight is going to be finally an explanation of what was nonsense and what was real and how this actually went, which is not the way a lot of people thought, even after they read the affidavit.
Right, and of course, still a very active case. Keith Morrison with Dateline, we thank you so much for your time. We are really looking forward to this program tonight. Of course, the story has great significance on the state of Idaho. All right, Dateline's Killing in a College Town airs tonight right here on KTVB at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.